Okay, can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for joining us for a design subcommittee meeting of the Boston Civic Design Commission. Today's date is Tuesday, September 17th, and this is session A of the BCDC Design Subcommittee. The Planning Department continues hosting public meetings in a virtual setting for the health, safety, and accessibility of Boston residents. My name is Seth Reisman, Deputy Director for Design Review at the City of Boston Planning Department. Before we proceed with the agenda, open meeting law requires that the Commission staff notify the public that this meeting is being recorded. Therefore, please be aware that the Commission staff is making an audio and video recording of this meeting. Please turn off your camera and microphone if you do not wish to be recorded. For the purposes of the record, Commissioners Mick-Young Kim, David Manfredi, and Laura Solano are present, and we may be joined by Commissioner Kotoridis. Tonight's agenda will include presentations for Wentworth Institute of Technology and 250 Everett Street. Tonight's meeting proceedings will follow the typical BCDC Design Subcommittee meeting format, beginning with a brief presentation from their proponent, comments from BCDC commissioners, and public testimony. First project up is Wentworth Institute of Technology. A proposed 10-year institutional master plan for Wentworth seeking Article 80D entitlement contemplates 6 proposed institutional projects on an approximately 31-acre site. This will be the 4th presentation of the proposed IMP to the Design Subcommittee, following introduction at the June 27th, 2023 monthly meeting, followed by Design Subcommittee meetings on May 21st, July 23rd, and August 20th, 2024. Commissioners Mick-Young Kim, Mimi Love, Anne-Marie Lubenow, and Bill Ron were present at the most recent BCDC Design Subcommittee and recommended the proposed project for additional review. Commissioner Kim joins us this evening, should be prepared to deliver remarks at the start of the deliberation. It is my understanding that there are no commissioners present who intend to recuse themselves. Before I turn this over to the team for their presentation, I would like to quickly share with the commissioners some material staff has prepared that summarizes the key consideration of the Avenue of the Arts Design Guidelines study as it relates to the Wentworth campus. And let me see if I can change the screen I'm sharing. Okay, can folks see the screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So published by the BRA in 2015 after a community process, the Avenue of the Arts Design Guidelines study was meant to help guide the anticipated future growth along this critical corridor between Mass Ave to the east and Longwood Ave in the west. The study included 4 general principles: create a clear, safe, well-connected pedestrian experience. The avenue should be a cohesive, high-quality environment. Institutions should express their identity through architecture and open spaces. The avenue should be an active, inclusive urban environment. New development and initiatives should promote pedestrian comfort in the public realm.
Unknown caller.
The study highlighted the inconsistent quality of the public realm sidewalks along the corridor, ranging from generous 20-foot sidewalks in some places to 3-foot wide pinch points in others. The study recommended sidewalk dimensions for new development consistent with citywide standards, encouraging ample room for walking and cafe zones where appropriate. The study highlights a number of unique spaces that create a cadence of activity nodes, referred to as welcome mats. These public spaces allow institutions to create open, accessible, and usable and unique gathering areas. The study also identified the important role that cross streets have in supporting connectivity and placemaking throughout the district. Relevant to the IMP is the Wentworth IMP is the welcome mat. Here, if you can see my cursor, and cross connection established by the Mass Art Treehouse, which is not part of Wentworth's campus, and the adjacent cross connection for Huntington Avenue. Since the creation of the study, this idea has been significantly bolstered by Wentworth's proposed pedestrian pike concept, which is not shown on this map, but continues this desire line, as well as the Ruggles Street welcome mat here, and its relationship to newly created open space and public realm improvements at the 500 Huntington site. And what you see on the map here is the previously approved version of 500 Huntington at the time of this study. Since then, the version of 500 Huntington that has been approved now has open space occupying this full corner. The study also prioritizes environmental comfort in the public realm. The guidelines suggest maximum heights for street walls and podiums, with taller building elements stepped back in proportion to their height in order to minimize shadows on the north side of Huntington Ave. As buildings increase in height, setback distances should increase as well. The study prioritizes the zone closest to Huntington as an area for setbacks to increase sidewalk width, step backs to minimize the impact of taller buildings, while also acknowledging that the existing condition includes multiple towers that more directly engage the street with their height, such as Northeastern's West Village H Tower and Mass Art's Treehouse here. And here's a summary of the guidelines as applied to Wentworth site. Here you see the previous scheme for 500 Huntington. Again, the open space has now been shifted to the corner, as well as the treehouse, and isn't detailed here, but the welcome mat that's shifted off to the left and engages with Huntington Avenue. A desire for tower setbacks at the higher level above podium or street wall height, and the opportunity for taller buildings even deeper into the site. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the proponent team. And before I do so, let me stop share and invite the team to share. And a reminder to proponents that presentations will be limited to 15 minutes. I will give you all a halftime warning and a 2-minute warning. And with that, I invite the proponent team to begin presenting whenever ready.
Thank you, Seth, and I hope all of you can see my screen as well. Appreciate the opportunity to come back and share with you our progress and updates. And this truly has been a collaborative effort, and building on the timeline as Seth was outlining, we've also had a series of work sessions with the BPDA staff and team in reviewing aspects of it. What I do want to highlight here is that, as Seth mentioned, the last time we presented to the subcommittee back in July, it was to focus on the open space, where we walked through the character of each of these open spaces. Subsequently, in August, we were reviewing the massing, and there were 3 critical areas that were highlighted that we would like to focus our presentation today on.
Adam, my apologies. I just want to check to make sure that the audience can see the screen, because for some reason I cannot.
Oh,
Could I actually ask you to unshare and reshare, Gautam?
absolutely. Happy
So
to
let me
do
make
that.
sure we have this for the recording.
Let me try it in a different way. So can you see my screen with the PowerPoint slide?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Apologies for that. And so let me just, I won't report the whole narrative, but I think the key thing that I wanted to reinforce today is that as we've had a series of subcommittee meetings, we focused on the open space back in July. We've since then met with the BPDA staff as we started to prepare and present the massing last time. And there are 3 critical questions that we want to address today. The first is about clarifying the hierarchy of the overall pedestrian circulation through the campus, and how do we see that circulation as we look at many of the overall improvements from the campus and the open spaces themselves. To also then, the second point was to look at the Huntington Avenue, and it builds on what Seth was just sharing as how that has informed our overall thinking around how the campus, Wentworth campus, meets the Huntington Avenue edge condition. And then lastly, to further study the West Quad community itself and to look at how we can continue to make that a much more clarified housing community that also has a clearer idea on the open space. So these will be the three specific topics of focus in our presentation today with you. So I'll start with the first question on the hierarchy of the pedestrian circulation. And so this is just as a very quick reminder, just showing you the overall existing campus and then also the plan that we had shared with you last time. And clarifying to you some of the significant open spaces and the overall circulation. Commissioner Solano, you had talked to us as well about how do you really choreograph the overall circulation. So it's not about how people move, but it's overall how do you really choreograph that overall experience. And we want to reiterate with the improvements that we are trying to do, really reinforce in many ways, sort of picking up on what Seth was sharing, these broader east-west strong connections along Ruggles Street that connect us all the way from the fence to the southwest corridor, engaging that welcome mat in front of Wentworth Hall, the connection from the colleges of the Fenway all the way through what is a completely reimagined idea for pedestrian pike or a promenade that will connect us all the way out towards the southwest corridor as well. But in addition is to make Wentworth Hall as a new gateway. So building on the welcome mat is to make that a new entrance for our students to really open up towards the broader community and really engage that as the primary pedestrian circulation that brings you towards the heart of the campus. And to really think about these important east-west connections and the main entrance coming off of Ruggles Street to the core of the campus. And that is how we've framed the overall open spaces, set the hierarchy of the pedestrian circulation, but also looked at how we imagine the building interventions to really support and reinforce what we see as the pedestrian circulation that we would like to imagine for our campus, whether it is visitors, whether it's the students, or whether it's the broader community that makes this campus much more permeable as they connect from the fence all the way out to the southwest corridor. Okay. The second point that we want to talk to you about is the overall Huntington Avenue experience itself. Building on what Seth shared with you, we were really informed by the overall Avenue of the Arts guidelines. But a key part of this was also about how we reimagine the edges. Specifically around Huntington Avenue, there are three critical nodes that we wanted to highlight and integrate as part of our overall master plan. The first is the intersection of Huntington and Ruggles. And as you can remember that this was seen as the welcome mat. How do we really extend that green space and create a very civic, but also a very important identity corner for Wentworth as well. The second was the highlighted welcome mat, which is also a very important intersection of the pedestrian connection from the fence and the College of Fenway, where it comes into the Wentworth campus and begins the pedestrian pike and the promenade connection all the way out towards the southwest corridor. So that was the second very important node. And then the third is at the intersection of Ward and Huntington Avenue, which is also highlighted here. These were three very important critical nodes that we have seen as spaces of emphasis that we would like to have about how Wentworth campus is seen and has a presence along these three critical points. So imagine if we were to take a walk along that ground plane itself. So this is when we are along Huntington Avenue, that's Ward Street. What we're proposing at that very first intersection point is to have a taller building mass along that corner of Ward Street and Huntington, but more importantly, having a very active edge along that ground floor itself. So as it's framing the street edge along Huntington, it also starts to create a strong corner along Ward Street as well, to pull that edge back to really create a much more stronger ground plane relief at that corner too, that makes it much more engaging at that street level too. Here you can also see beyond what was previously shown for the massing along what was the previous tower, you'll start to see in the transformation, what we're proposing now, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is our extension of that street edge at that same height of 80 feet and extending that datum along Huntington Avenue and then stepping back the taller tower away from the Huntington Avenue edge itself. As we continue down this walk to that second critical node, which is also defined as that welcome mat, this is the tree house highlighted in gray. This is the previous massing that we had shown you of the tower along Huntington Avenue. And then this is what Seth referred as the pedestrian pike, which continues all the way through the Wentworth campus. So this is how we had it before. And what we are now proposing is that we have that 80 feet high street edge and that podium that defines the edge along Huntington Avenue, and then stepping back the taller mass from the Huntington Avenue edge itself, and then also starting to create a new green space that now fronts the pedestrian promenade itself. And if you were to look at that more closely, this is what we showed you previously, where the residential building was framing the pedestrian promenade between what is the MWRA facility, and this is our pedestrian promenade. This is the new transformation, is now we have an 85 feet wide open space that would now front this pedestrian promenade as a way of getting more southern exposure into that open space, but also defining that with the overall buildings. And I'll come to the overall massing and the site plan of this in the third point. And then lastly, as we come to the third very important intersection in the node, which is along Huntington Avenue, this is Huntington Avenue, this is Huntington Avenue, and this is Ruggles Street, is to really reimagine this as that very important civic node where it becomes a welcome green space that brings you and draws you closer to what will be the new pavilion as the new gateway and entrance into the campus itself. This was the previous massing that we had shown to you for the West Tower. And what we are now proposing is that we have the 80-foot high podium that really fronts and forms the edge along Huntington Avenue, but the taller volume is then set back from that height. And so now you see a continuity with that 80-foot height podium that goes all along the Huntington Avenue edge, defining that, and then the taller massing is back. Okay? And so now seeing that height relationship in context to the entire Huntington Avenue, here you can see that what we have proposed for that West Tower, Huntington Avenue Tower, it's about 250 feet in height, and it is less than the tree house, and also as you see it in relationship to what's been proposed for 500 Huntington as well. And similarly, the other buildings that are the replacement for the Baker Hall as well, you can see that the building massing at the corner of Huntington Avenue and Ward Street. So that is that intersection that I was highlighting earlier. So these are the three very important nodes, as I mentioned. One, the two with a welcome mat, and then three where it's a much more of a civic entrance. So then moving on to the third item on our list that we want to share with you is about the West Lot massing and the open space. And this has been one that we've had a lot of rigorous and discussions back and forth with the BPDA staff and team pretty much on a daily basis, and sharing ideas and having discussions on what we felt was the most favorable option. In our original option, what we had shown previously to you was the residential tower would be fronting along the pedestrian pike or the pedestrian promenade. So that is the residential building. This is the taller residential tower that fronts along Huntington Avenue as well. So this is what we had shown you before. These were two options that we studied further with the BPDA staff. One idea was about turning the entire residential building in the north-south direction and then orienting it along the academic building itself. For purposes of phasing, constructability, financing, and also the relationship of the academic building to the open space, this was one that we did not consider strongly for Wentworth and the overall master plan. The second option is the one that we have been leaning towards and further advancing. In this option, looking at turning the academic building and maybe reducing that in dimension, pulling back the overall height of the taller mass of Huntington Tower further back. But more importantly, the big change is to create this new open space that really fronts the pedestrian promenade and has southern exposure as well. And so we took this option 2 as an idea and further studied that to explore that further. And so here you see that option in an overall sketch for the overall master plan today, where we continue to reinforce the overall pedestrian pike as a very strong pedestrian connector all the way from the fence and all the way through. And then what we're showing here is a slightly widened academic building from what you had seen in the previous sketch to make it much more right-sized to what we believe would be a good dimension and a floor plate sized for accommodating all of the academic uses. And then pulling the residential building closer to it. So this way, the academic building still continues to have a strong relationship with the open space, and then have the same 85 feet wide green space that now fronts the pedestrian promenade. We are having that podium, as I've shown you, which is that 80-foot high podium along Huntington Avenue, and then pulling back the taller the massing for the residential tower itself and pulling that back, as these are now two parallel to each other, and it starts to reinforce that overall east-west connectivity all the way from the fence, and maintains that sort of legibility of that orthogonal grid as well in some ways, that keeps that that composition of the series of open spaces from the new West Lot open space to the main quad, and as we continue on to the annex quad as well. We also looked at many precedents that we were inspired by as we think about the overall open space quality as well, and as we think about the heights of the buildings. Of course, the Bailey Park in New York City is a great precedent of that type of a microspace that could be programmed in many different ways, but also has that sense of intimacy as we think about this this type of an open space, given the residential uses that we have, as one that is meant more for a quieter and calmer student use itself. The other examples we looked at is the St. Giles Court in London as well, framed by a series of mixed-use buildings. It's a much more urban space, but what we really appreciate about the quality of the ground plane is where you have many transparent ground floor uses, which can be seen as student life, co-working, lobby spaces, and other retail, and then really making that a much more permeable open space that's much more urban in nature, but also allows many programming opportunities too. Another very similar precedent was Teardrop Park, very similar in proportion as you think about the open space too, as what we're showing for the south-facing green space as well. And just looking at this from proportion as it relates to the taller buildings that frame the overall open space, that we felt that there are ways that we could also start to create that type of microclimate. And then lastly, at Northeastern University, the International Village Roof Garden as well, which is a shaded space, but it continues to be a very accessible and a vibrant, actively used student space that even the shaded environment is appreciated as a series of diversity of different types of spaces themselves as part of the broader campus itself. And then lastly, thinking about the linear spaces themselves, this is 550 Madison Avenue in New York City, where you could imagine some of these spaces to be also covered and semi-covered spaces that allow the pedestrian flow, but also allow a much more year-round use as well, as a way to really help activate and energize the ground plane and its relationship to the way it could be programmed for student use in other ways as well. And so finally, from a massing standpoint, this is the overall massing that we had shown you previously, where the entire green space was framed by a series of buildings like the residential tower, the tree house, and the two residential towers, and the academic building. And what we are now proposing is to reduce the overall dimension of the academic building, so we do get a little taller from a height standpoint to make sure that we meet the overall academic goals and needs, but then to also pull this residential building closer to it that allows us to create this new green space fronting the promenade. And then we also have an additional green space that now all of these buildings are organized around these series of open spaces themselves. The overall height for the Huntington residential tower stays the same, but although we had to, because we have pulled this back from the Huntington Avenue street side, we've had to accommodate some of that gross square feet into this residential building itself. And so that has gone up to 190 feet. So this is a 250 feet height, which is the same as before. This has gone up to 190 feet to accommodate the area that we've lost. And then the academic building, maintaining that at the same overall area, we've gone to 150 feet height. All of these heights are inclusive of the penthouse and any appurtenances.
Would you mind, sorry to interrupt you,
Sure.
going back to that slide and kind of toggling slowly back and forth? Because I know this was the big issue the last time we
Sure.
spoke, and it's a lot of information. Appreciate all the work you've put into it. Just wondering if you could just, so it seems like the big change is to Pike Residential Hall, that's
This one,
gotten
yes.
taller. and the residential, Huntington residential tower has gotten lower, is that right?
So the Huntington Tower residential tower has stayed the same height.
It
But what
stayed the
has-
same height,
But what
okay.
we've done is rather than kinking this towards Huntington Avenue, we've
Mm.
regularized that to be parallel. As you may remember, Commissioner Kim, there's a lot of concern that this entire open
Yeah,
space
no, I
would be
remember
in
that.
shade.
Yeah,
So what we've done is, I'll try to go through this slower. is
yeah,
now you
that'd
can
be
see
great.
the academic building's gone smaller. The residential building has also gotten a little narrower and pulled it closer to the academic building, thereby allowing
Uh-huh.
nearly 85 feet wide green space that is now has the southern exposure as well.
And would you mind just doing that once more for me,
Sure.
like slowly, and then go back,
Yeah,
and then what you have now?
right.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. And so as you can see that while we have also been able to create more open space, you can see how the buildings, Huntington Tower also now follows that same orthogonal nature of defining these open spaces themselves.
Mhm.
And this is a long section of it, if you think about this at the colleges of the Fenway. And this is a great section to look at the series of open spaces. So this is our welcome mat from Huntington Avenue. This is now the overall open space, nearly 260 to 270 feet in length, that are now framed by the residential building and the academic building on one side. We have the quad and then the new green space, which is created by the replacement of the annex buildings. So this is the long section, which is more or less along the east-west side. And then the second section, which is more along the north-south direction, this is looking towards the Tree House and Huntington Avenue. Here is where we have the residential building getting to 190, 250 as we had before, the open space nearly about 115 feet in width, and then we have the pedestrian promenade along the south side of that residential building. We see a lot of permeability at the ground plane, and I'll come back to that in a more detailed section. And so here is another section along that same condition where you can see the section of the open space, nearly 170 feet long open space that now fronts the pedestrian promenade, and that becomes a way of also coming into this green space too, and that relationship. And so this is an important ground plane experience, and that relationship of the residential tower, imagining ground floor uses, active uses along that ground floor. And so this is a sketch idea about how we imagine that inside-outside relationship of having retail, active uses of student co-working, collaboration spaces in the first few levels of the building that spill out into a series of open spaces that could be shaded, a pavilion, and then that continues on to what is seen as the pedestrian promenade, and really thinking about that to be a very tree-lined pedestrian promenade that also creates many opportunities for rain gardens and other stormwater features that allow, think about this to be sort of a way of re-evoking the idea of the Stony Brook that used to be here many, many years ago, and really starting to see that as a strong relationship of that open space connecting all the way out towards the pedestrian pike itself. So this is a detailed section. One more time, I'll just show you. This is a detailed section that cuts through the academic building, going all the way out towards the pedestrian promenade, as an idea of how we imagine that entire ground floor of all of these buildings to be very active. And that sort of brings us to the conclusion of sort of showing you where we are today from the master plan, and working very closely with the BPDA staff to bring a lot more legibility and clarity about how we are reimagining the west lot in response to many of the questions and the comments we received from the BCDC committee the last time we presented. Seth, I think we would love to hear from you.
Thank you. It's that second secret mute button. Thank you, team, for that. And as I turn it over to the commissioners, just want to remind everybody that this is a Article 80D approval. So this is a sort of zoning overall massing level approval, and all of these buildings will be back in front of the commission at the 80B design level for the buildings and open spaces themselves. questions or comments from the commissioners?
I have a question, Gautam. And first of all, I do think there's greater clarity in terms of the hierarchy of paths. It's clearly the Pike, and I think you've made that feel, at least graphically, you've certainly made that feel as the most important path, and I think it's important to physically make that too, in terms of even where you've got tight spaces between Beatty and I think that's the Innovation Building, just to the, right there. You can expand it visually by letting the path be wider than the space actually is, and and let it slip into or under the building. I'm wondering, my question is, the building on Huntington Avenue, in plan, it's also, but you see it in massing, feels chunky, feels big, not necessarily too tall, but big. And I'm looking at the treehouse, and I'm looking at your other residential building, and they seem so thinly elegant. What's happening there? Something's happening in plan, is my guess. And maybe it's also, if you go to the three-dimensional, maybe it's also, there you go, that one. Well, I was going to say it's the surrounding buildings, but it's not. What's happening there? Why am I feeling that way?
That this is wider. Good questions. So given we are at the planning phase, let me first start with the lower level podium. So from a dimension standpoint, we've sort of always had that as the, that lower level podium. Like if you remember, this was always the podium, and we've always seen this to be a place to have many public facing programs and functions, retail amenities, and many other aspects that would be part of that first 4 levels of that podium. The other aspect is, given where we are from a planning stage, we want to have we'd like Wentworth to have the flexibility of planning the unit typologies and the overall width. We think that as we get to that level, we will be able to start thinking about making them much skinnier to 55 feet or towards that dimension. And that would be something that we will absolutely be addressing as we get to 80B, to the next phase. And maybe that's why, David, your point, it's feeling like it's much wider than it needs to be. And we absolutely appreciate, and we 100% agree that there is an elegance to making this much slimmer. In fact, the way we would think about the overall massing for this to be slimmer, maybe that there's the level where it meets this podium could also be thought as one that comes in to making it much more, also to create more variation. So these would be all aspects that we absolutely agree and would study further at that next stage.
I have to say, I do like the piece that fronts onto Huntington lower, and then the tower set back. It's very very kind to the treehouse, which is nice coming, especially when you're traveling west out of the city. And I actually I like the simpler massing form than the bent form, which made it look even, I don't know, somehow bigger and more intrusive, like out of scale with the surround. I mean, you're adding density here, you're adding height here, but I appreciate that the historic part of campus maintains a scale, and they're basically building a new quad, a new leg, anchored by a building that is not Wentworth, but part of the ensemble quite nicely.
And to your point on density, we're adding density, but we're also adding density in a manner that doesn't add that density in the, along the Huntington Avenue corridor. It's sort of behind the treehouse. It's, as you can see, many of the, sections that it's not something that's totally visible as well.
I mean, the last time we saw the project, there was, if you go back to the previous iteration, there was a lot of hand wringing about that central courtyard and the quality of that space. And I think, so what you've done is you've slid it over and you've made it taller so that you've created a bigger portal towards that axis that David's talking about, the pedestrian axis. And I think it does help to do that. But I'm still not sure. So now you've broken up that quad into kind of two different pieces.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to figure out, I do think it makes it feel kind of, the scale feels better. But I wonder if you've exacerbated, like the height of Pike Residence Hall has gotten taller so that that courtyard that's flanked by Huntington Residential Tower and the Pike Residential Tower now has an even more difficult condition. Because the width of this quad is the same, right, as it was before, but just more of a cavern than it was before. That wasn't my word. That was a word that was developed by other commissioners, and so I'm just trying to, as I'm thinking aloud, I think that pulling this over does kind of give it a little breathing space, whereas what you had before, there was kind of, if you could go back to that, there's like an equidistant portal on both sides. And but I don't know if you've made part of it much better and part of it more difficult, more cavern-like. And so I'm not sure what to think about it. It's a challenging problem that you have to understand. What does this quad do? And maybe as I'm talking this through, the idea that you split this into two, if you go back to the current design, you could argue that that quad has some relationship to the academic building, and it's kind of more of an academic quad, and that the other one is more of a pedestrian. Like maybe what's
Right.
throwing me off is they're both drawn as these green blocks, but your section tells a much richer story,
Right.
right? And it might be, one could argue that I'll call it the academic quad. I think you had some architectural kind of ceilings there and things like that. And it might be that within this master plan, there's a differentiation between these two green blocks
Yes.
to kind of mitigate, because that is one technique we use in landscape, is when you're in a kind of cavern, you try to make a ceiling
Exactly.
canopy to change the scale of that space, and kind of acknowledge that it's going to be dark. And not green, not a lawn.
Yes.
So that might be gray, not green, but it's
Right.
open space. I understand this is a diagram, but
No,
so I'm trying to think aloud, because I know you guys have seen us quite a bit, and but for me, it's still, I'm not sure. I feel like the two spaces may be too similar in scale, like they're two rectangles that are similar to each other. But I think the overall diagram is moving in a more interesting direction.
so
Yeah.
I do
Go ahead.
agree with your observations, and that's actually what has also driven some of the precedents when we think about it. When we met with the BPDA staff, also we looked at, what are we missing when you look at the program? You imagine this to be more of a community space, right? It's a park
Right.
for the neighborhood. This
Right.
is really the Wentworth quad where all the celebration and the Wentworth community comes together. This one's more of an academic type of a quad. And this is more about a residential. This is the third space. This is the quieter space. And so we imagine, like as I showed you in the section, that this becomes much more of the active part of that space. But then here, this is more of a hardscape, like the 550 Madison Avenue, New York City, where we bring a sense of intimacy and shade by creating that trellis. And that really helps a way of not only tying these together, but makes a stronger relationship about how that space starts to be used, and creates that ceiling as a way to really kind of disconnect you from the overall height as well, and create that sense of space.
Okay, so I'm believing that. Can I see the section again?
Sure.
The really lovely hand sketch that you had?
Yes.
Because I think that's an important part of this diagram, and right now it's
Mhm.
drawn sort of in the middle. But if we go back to this is a kind of, I hate to do this, like I'm not the designer, but if we could go back to now the 3D massing, it's hard for me to correlate these two. I know these are all master plan sketches, but if you could go back one further. I like the language even further, the one that shows all three spaces, that's right. That somehow you really differentiate these two spaces, and instead of what I'm reading or extrapolating from the section to this is that there's some kind of architectural canopy in the middle as an
Yes.
object. But what if that architectural canopy was a frame?
Mhm.
And it kind of framed that rectangular space that you're pointing to and really was related to the academic building. So it differentiated these two, and that's part of the master plan as a kind of architectural massing element.
So I'm going to say something that might be a little controversial, but things that we
Go for
considered.
it.
Okay, so amongst us boys and girls, right?
Yeah,
We talked about a winter garden as well as a
Yeah.
space that we are missing in this campus. So if this is going to be a space that's going to be in shade, let's just make it a seasonal 24/7, 365 days a year type of a space.
Yeah.
And really celebrate that this is a space and we need diversity of different types of
Right.
space. So does that
Right.
become more like a winter garden?
right. It could be, you guys are the designers, but I think what I'm figuring out what I'm trying to say, it feels like a Friday afternoon, even though it's only Tuesday night, is that maybe the two spaces, you've pulled this over and you're starting to signal to the commission that there are different spaces, but maybe that academic quad space does need to be different. And I love the idea that it's all season, whether it has to be all enclosed, I don't know.
Yes.
But I think that rather than creating an object in the middle of it, somehow that it's circumscribed by
Mhm.
something, and really maybe it has some capacity to open and close or something like exciting like that. But then I think I could really understand the two spaces and their relationship to each other.
Yeah, and our goal was we've really looked at many options, and which is why we've been
I bet
working
you
with
did.
Seth and his
Yeah.
team very closely, and coming to share with you that this is an approach that we felt met many of those broader goals, and it has the potential for us to now further advance this to the type of richness that Commissioner
Yeah.
King, you were just talking about.
The last thing that I just want to mention is I think a missed opportunity in this diagram, if green represents shared collective space, that some of these roof spaces that you have that you show in sections planted, I would show them on the building as
Agreed.
collective space, so that I think it would kind of liven the space. And
Mhm.
when I think of residential conditions, I think of like many different kinds of nook spaces and things
Yeah.
like that. So
Yeah.
I think that could be also an easy tweak,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, it could
I
be
do
like,
appreciate the effort because I've realized now how tricky of a problem this is. And I encourage you as much as you can to
Mhm.
keep going, because when you talked about inside, outside between the academic building and the exterior, I got very excited. I thought, "Oh, that'd be unlike any other space at Wentworth and would be very popular, I
Mhm.
think. So keep going.
Thank you. I think Commissioner Solano has her
Yeah.
hand raised.
Oh, yeah, I'd never have any comments, so we can just race right by. No, first I have some clarifying questions. I know this is the firehouse, correct? What is this space and this space on to the side of Wentworth? Is that all parking?
So can I go to the plan? Because these are
Yeah,
really
please.
more diagrammatic. Okay, so so this is purely visitor and AD accessible parking. So we will have a curb cut, which is currently existing off of Ruggles, where visitors and folks who require with disability will come and park here and then connect across and come into the campus itself. And that's what it's being limited to. We also have access for an underground parking level. So those would be below this courtyard itself. And so this becomes service and loading, and there will be absolutely some screening that will happen along this edge. And so this becomes really the back of house and the service and parking. And that's not the reason why, but we want to make sure that from a pedestrian circulation standpoint, we are really imagining this to be a main primary pedestrian access and gateway into the core of the campus.
I'm sorry, explain this part again.
Maybe there's a way. I
Let
can
me
erase-
erase and you can zoom in.
Yeah, so maybe I can raise this. And we have done these studies at a much more hardline and detailed manner where this becomes a ramp. So if you're a visitor or parking at this lower level, you basically come down and you park at the basement of the parking level that's below this courtyard over here. The service also would come off of this, which is a completely managed where they would come in, turn in, and then have a service court over here. And so we have that far more. I know I'm sort of waving my hand and explaining this, but these were all drawn to detail to the types of truck and
Sure,
service.
sure.
And we reviewed that with the BPDA staff and team to make sure that they're comfortable with the overall circulation.
Well, just spatially, is this on grade or is that part of the going down? I know I'm getting into probably.
No, it's a fair
detail.
question. This area would be at grade with the plaza, but there will be a screening,
Yeah.
some kind of a screening mechanism that makes sure that we are not looking into that. And also we're using the architecture as a way to tuck in the service and loading functions, so you don't really see into that. We don't need the full width of it.
Yep,
Um,
okay, thank you, that's all very helpful. If we can go back to the one that we were, the one that you and Commissioner Kim were speaking over. Okay, perfect. Well, you didn't do yourself any favors by putting that path in there and dividing the landscape up. So just a little hint. But I get what you're doing. I'm less concerned about this as an open space as long as the building is respectful of that. And
Mhm.
what I mean by that, I know you have intentions for the ground floor being active, but I also wonder, and I know that these buildings are set back, they're, they have a pedestal and they're set back, but I wonder if about working this one harder, the pedestal of the, does it rotate so that you're actually kind of scooped into that green? And in that rotation, does it help the green on the other side? I don't know, but I think what I'm trying to say is, don't think of these buildings as just kind of their separate pieces, but instead, since it's a residential building, think about, whether or not there are balconies that can kind of always keep things enlivened on that side, or whether or
Absolutely.
not there's a
Mhm.
social space
Mhm.
that can do that. Because I think when the buildings, and particularly, closer to the ground, when the buildings and the landscape can engage,
Mhm.
it's much better,
Right.
right? Because then even when the space is empty, there's still activity, there's still people. It's sort of like the Smith Campus Center. They've
Yes.
done a terrific job on that of keeping it lively all the time. The other thing that working the base of that building do harder work is that while I agree there's a clarity about the corridor, it can also be really insistent, right, as a straight line. And I think the buildings can help that.
Mhm.
And you're already starting to do it, but the pushing and pulling of the base of the buildings, I think, will go a long way to kind of enlarging that corridor so that the landscape feels like it comes more into the buildings, right? And there's a better conversation, frankly, between them.
Yep.
So that you start to get opportunities, at every base, there's something there to either grab your attention or skewed or pulled back or something that maybe can take the curse off of that. After so many years in the first, the existing master plan, this is going to be such a breath of fresh air. It really is. And the devil is going to be in the details for sure. But even at this massing level, I think you need to sort of put those intentions on paper about how landscape and buildings can engage with each other.
I 100% agree with you, and which is why I included this sketch as a way to sort of share with you how we're thinking about this, in how we can, not only imagine outdoor spaces, balconies. I definitely need to make that also reflected on the residential building, but at the ground plane too, the buildings don't have to come and meet the floor. We could have them set back to let the landscape come further in to create covered spaces. And these could themselves be reimagined as urban rooms themselves versus as exclusive spaces, but they're seen as enclosed urban spaces too, and really have that pedestrian pike to vary in width to create different interstitial spaces and experiences along that. It doesn't want to be a wide walkway that leads you from point A to point B, but we want you to stop intentionally, look into the buildings, see a gallery space, see an architectural review going on, see a robotics that has been created in the engineering buildings, and really start to engage and make that aspect of that academic experience on display.
Yeah.
I think he just offered to host future BCDC meetings at the base of that building.
But I 100% agree with you, Commissioner Solano. It's like this is sort of the aspects of how do we start to create levels of experience. And that's what makes cities so memorable, is those experiences where it's just not at the ground plane. It continues to become vertical campuses themselves.
Yeah. And in terms of, I think that Commissioner Kim's comments about that being shade are absolutely important to pay attention to. But I also feel that one can make a great landscape in shade. So
100% agree.
Gautam, do you envision that crossing Huntington, if you go back to one of the plans, you show the pike crossing Huntington as if it was the pavers cross, the texture crosses. Is that the intention?
As from a master plan standpoint, we would love for that intention to follow through as a way of that bigger connection. Now, of course, Wentworth does not control all of this area as well, but we're working with, Wentworth is actively working with all of our collaborators, even the MWRA and Mass Art, in a series of discussions about how we reimagine the public realm around a unified idea and approach. But it'd be wonderful.
Is that a signalized intersection today?
No, it's not a signalized intersection. But it is a very important pedestrian connection coming through.
It is. It is. It's unfortunate it doesn't land the way you exactly want it to land.
Yeah, that's right.
At some point I had a study. I'm not sure if it's in this deck or not. Maybe it's been removed. Oh, there it is. So this is the view today. So there's a painted crosswalk coming along. There is a signal. And then and you can see this is a green space that Wentworth currently owns that has got a series of fences and columns that enclose that space. And what we are proposing is that we have the pavers come all the way across. You have a much wider and a clearer amenity zone, a wide sidewalk. Take away all those fences and impediments and really think of this all together as one welcome mat, as Seth was sharing earlier, to make it one green space. There is some green space in front of Treehouse as well. Let's make all of this into one civic space. That with that, then with the Treehouse coming there, the podium coming there, and the edge of the Baker Hall replacement, all of these front doors now are opening up into this very important civic space. And the scale of space, once you remove all those impediments, really is one that could be really gracious.
And you're drawing it here, though, that the crosswalk is perpendicular to the street.
Yes,
It doesn't cut across as an angle, and that, you know, that might be the better solution
yes.
because of how it lands you on the.
Yeah.
Is
Agreed.
that Tetlow, on the north side of Tetlow? Yeah.
Agreed.
And it heads you right into
The pedestrian promenade.
the park. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Can you go back to the plan that shows you had one like a before and after? Are there any other comments? I just wondered if, yeah. I mean, I think overall, there's a lot of really strong things in the transformation of this plan. If you just squint and you look at
Sorry.
the kind
Yeah.
of, that's okay. You look at what was parking, what its relationship to Huntington Avenue is, the way in which you're extending the gracious kind of relationship of Huntington Avenue with these welcome mats. I think these are all really strong transformations of this whole neighborhood. And so I want to commend you on that. I think it's not an easy site. It's because it's triangulates, Huntington Avenue triangulates against this edge. And I think that, as Laura has said, I think the devil's in the details. I don't know if she said that, but I think that there could be another level of how you describe the landscape, and that it's not just green in this master plan, but that there's like a gray green, there's a green, and then there's like a blue or something like that.
Right.
Because you talk, the language you use to describe the landscape is much richer and much more varied than the diagram shows. And I think the reason why, as a commission, we take these master plans so seriously is because they are a blueprint for the future. And this is such an important neighborhood, and such an exciting project, because this neighborhood needs a transformation for sure. And what's great about this neighborhood is you've already got lots of people walking through it, but now they walk through in many different ways, and they cross Huntington Avenue in very confused ways. And so I think there's a lot of really good things in here. And I think the landscape could afford to be more nuanced in how it's
Absolutely.
displayed. And I think you already have it, your team probably already understands it and has it in your brain. But I think there's a real transformation when I look at the existing campus to where we are today with this plan. And so I commend you on that. I think that's great.
I appreciate your comments, and I will, would like to also highlight, we have an amazing client in Wentworth who has really prioritized the open space as a great way of creating a sense of campus and a sense of community, not just for Wentworth, but also for the community as we define all the neighborhoods together. And for us, it's to advance, and you may have seen from a previous iteration, the level of detail we've got into the landscapes architecture. And so we will expect to do that even at the master plan scale. That speaks to the diversity of types of open space, that speaks to the programming, but also the environmental opportunities that we see in here too. Because we know that this will take time, but we want to make sure that those principles hold through the overall implementation and the life.
Commissioners, before getting to next steps, should we see if there is any public testimony?
Yes.
Okay. So at this time, we'd like to invite any members of the public in attendance who may wish to contribute public testimony to raise your digital hand, and I will call on you. If you are calling in by phone, press the number 9 on your dial pad to activate the raise hand function, and dial 6 to unmute yourself. Please state your name and any relevant project affiliation information, and please keep your comments to 2 minutes. So I am looking to see if we have any public testimony. I do not see any raised hands, so I will conclude our public testimony. Stop sharing if the proponent could put back up a site plan, and I will turn it back to the commissioners to think about next steps.
Well, I suggest that this can go back to the full commission. Maybe with the request that at full commission you respond to some of the finer grain thoughts that both Laura and Mick Young have offered about the space between the space. I guess I'll call it that space, and whether it becomes more singular or whether there's also some built four season space or three season space, but focus on that for full commission.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree.
Okay, great. So hearing that, it is recommended for final consideration and a vote of recommendation at the next full committee. Team, thank you very much.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate all the feedback.
Okay. I will start sharing my screen for the next project. Just give me 1 minute, please.
Excuse me.
Okay. So a proposed project at 250 Everett Street in Brighton is seeking Article 80C and Article 80B entitlements, and it contemplates the development of approximately 250,000 square feet of residential use, approximately 240 dwelling units, and 120 off-street parking spaces in a single building on an approximately 1.82 acre site. This will be the first presentation of the proposed project to the subcommittee following an introduction, I believe, at the February 6, 2024 monthly meeting. It is my understanding that there are no commissioners present who intend to recuse themselves. As a reminder, proponent teams, that presentations will be timed to 15 minutes, and I will give you a halftime warning and a 1 or 2 minute warning. And with that, I invite the proponent team to share
While
whenever
they're
ready.
getting that up, Seth, were any of the commissioners who are present now at the last meeting?
So it was a full committee meeting, so I believe, I don't have a list exactly,
Got it.
but
That's good enough. Thank you.
most folks have seen this. And again, it was just an introduction at the full committee.
So this is the first subcommittee meeting, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, I'm seeing that proponent is having trouble to unmute, so let me double check that.
There, I think that worked, Seth.
Okay, Tim, you are on, but Brian, are you sharing your screen? Oh, looks like you're muted as well. Are folks seeing Brian's screen, or is it still coming
No.
up?
Not yet.
Okay. Brian, I might suggest unsharing and then trying to reshare.
Is Brian frozen or just very still?
I think Brian is still muted and not having success sharing his screen. So team, I don't know if you have someone else could maybe who has access to the presentation could share while Brian maybe reconnects.
I can try in 1 second, Seth. Apologies for the.
I'm gonna actually just reshare my screen for a second so that it reclaims it from what was in progress. Stop the share. Michelle, I see your hand up, so are you looking to share? Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay, Michelle, you should be able to unmute yourself and share now.
Okay, we can see that screen. So I apologize for the delay there, but good evening, members of the commission. Just a quick intro. My name is Tim Alexander with Mill Creek Residential. We're the proponent behind the 250 Everett Street project. I'm joined by members of our design team, namely Brian O'Connor from Cube 3, as well as Ian Ramey from Copley Wolf Design Group, who will do the majority of the presentation. But I thought I'd start with just a quick recap and summary of what we heard in February. Seth, you're right, it was February 6th when we were in front of the full commission. And as we started to, outline the proposal, we heard obviously two big groups of feedback. One certainly focused on the building, the vertical building itself, massing, building scale, length along Everett Street. And secondly, we heard about opportunities for enhancement or improvement of the way the building is sited on the parcel within the neighborhood, and ability to enhance open space opportunities and really bring to life, or start to bring to life, what the Western Ave corridor study has started to lay out in terms of a transportation network and pedestrian network. So since February, we've been hard at work with BPDA staff and had a very good collaborative process with them, I think over the course of 5 or 6 meetings, to really focus on those two things. One is, the siting of the building. How does vehicular access occur? What does that mean for open space? And I think we've got some very exciting developments to share on that front. And then secondly, of course, the vertical building itself. How do we break down the massing? How do we bring the scale to an appropriate level for the neighborhood, both today and in the future? And so that's what we'll focus on here. Brian O'Connor, if you're unmuted, I'll kick it over to you and you can run through the next slides.
I think he has not joined us yet, so I will continue
not-
for Cube 3.
He is not rejoined. Oh, maybe that's his.
That might
phone.
be his phone.
And I just saw a phone number. Join us. And I asked to unmute, and if somebody is on phone and trying to join, in order to unmute, I believe you have to press the number 9 on your dial pad. Actually, dial 6 to unmute yourself. Brian, if that's you.
I believe it is. I'll double check.
Seth, is it *6 or just 6?
I would try both.
There, he's
Yeah. Brian, are you
unmuted
there?
now.
Brian, we can hear you.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I really apologize. I have no screen at the moment, so I'm gonna ask Michelle to kick this off, and I'm gonna try to log back in on another machine. I apologize, guys. I'll join you in a moment.
Thanks, Brian. So as we were introduced, we were at the full BCDC in February. So quick reminder, the project site, it's 250 Everett Street in the Brighton neighborhood, right on the Alston line. The lot is approximately 80,000 square feet in the new Wackersy zoning district. The building's approximately 260 gross floor area, 240 units, 107 parking spaces. 65 feet tall with 6 floors. Giving you a little bit of context, the red building here is sort of the proposed massing. Looks like I have slides on, as well as some of the existing buildings, as well as some of the potential Wackersy future. A few context buildings here for scale. That's going to be interesting. For scale and context, as well as our initial site strategy that you saw in February, which was 2 U-shaped buildings. We heard a lot of feedback about I'm going to stop sharing and break that because that's not going to work.
Michelle, it could be full screen mode that's advancing the slides automatically. So if you maybe try not full screen, that might help.
Thank you. And so in February, we saw a 2-building scheme that had a below grade parking for the entirety of this site.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Michelle, again. Are other folks seeing your screen? Okay.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I have a black screen, which means the recording is black.
Okay.
Can I ask you to stop and reshare one more time just so that we can run the full gamut of technical glitches for this presentation? And sorry, it is still black. It might be the way in which you're sharing it or the full screen or part screen. Unfortunately not.
Right. Try one more.
I'm going to take the screen again for a second and then turn it back to you. See if that helps.
Sharing.
I can see that. Seth, maybe not.
Unfortunately, I cannot. I am going to log out and log back in. Okay, I can now see that. Thank you all for your patience.
Okay. Brian, if you have audio and you want to interrupt, jump back in. We didn't get very far. And so Brian needs to be unmuted.
All right, I'm sorry, guys. I apologize profusely. I'm sorry, technology. I think Tim did a quick intro, right, as to what we heard. All right, so I think I'll just jump back in. I wanted to reset the table quickly for where we left off on our massing strategy. I know we have 15 minutes and a lot of material, so I'm going to go really quick. I don't think I can make up all the lost time, but I'm going to try. So one of the things we agreed last time, or where we started, is to make sure we pushed all the parking below grade. The strategy was to treat the building massing like 2 buildings on Everett Street, ensure that all of the courtyards were sort of Everett Street facing to create that sort of rich pedestrian and human scale. And then in the initial plan, we had loading and parking on the north side, which is the right. If you can jump, Michelle. This is going to go really slowly. So one of the things we tried to do at the request of the sort of initial BCDC and working closely with staff is really analyze a lot of different approaches here. And most of this was focused on the notion of how do we get people and pedestrian circulation across the site and through the site. So we looked at ground level pass-throughs, we looked at separating buildings, we looked at sort of flipping different massing and pushing the buildings around on the site. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but what we ended up with is realizing, if you can jump to the next one, Michelle, that all of these moves really just came at either an extreme cost to the units or created operational challenges within the buildings or had significant cost impacts. As we were working through all of these things, we ended up spending a lot of really great time with the staff. And we sort of broke down a lot of the interaction with them into sort of 5 different buckets here. And the first was really focusing on current and future vehicular and pedestrian networks across and through the site, thinking about how to make the loading and service and parking access internal to the building rather than dedicated a section of the site on the north to that. And there's a real focus to try to, looking at 3 and 5 here together, push the building to the north, aggregate as much of the public open realm space as we could, create the most park-like setting, preserve the mature growth, and protect the vegetation that was on the site. And then the last thing was we spent a lot of time sort of exploring the balance of setbacks east and west against Everett and against future development on what we call the back side of the site, which is the west. Currently the back, never to be thought of as the back. We sort of recognize that this building lives in an area which is going to see a significant amount of additional development. So this is the big picture move here. The building massing shifted right or to the north about 30 feet. And the sort of red dotted lines are where the building was before, really tightening down the envelope on the north side or the right, opening up this really sort of rich landscape outdoor public realm space on the left, introducing a lot more articulation into the building massing itself to create some variety in the setbacks against Everett and against the parking lot on the backside. I think what we want to do is just let Ian talk here for a few minutes about sort of the public realm landscaping site design strategy that we were using in concert with this plan. But sorry, before we get to that, one other thing we spent quite a bit of time on with staff was, if we're doing internal loading, where does that go? How do we do that? And so there was this notion that there needed to be a curb cut along Everett somewhere. We looked at a scenario where it could be aligned with Raymond Street at the top. We looked at scenarios where we pushed it further south and lined it up with the courtyard, aligned it with a building leg. And we spent a tremendous amount of time analyzing this, making sure that everything worked. And this is kind of where we ended up. So you'll notice again on the left or the south side of the site, there's that broad public realm space with connections. We moved the main entry to the building where that big blue arrow is closer to the center of the site. In previous iterations, we had sort of anchored it all the way to the right on the north, but in thinking about how the building sits on the site and what we want to do to kind of activate the street edge, we moved that to the center. Vehicular access is in red, which serves both loading and service for the building and a ramp down to parking below grade. And then wrapping around the corner of the building on the south side, we relocated active program in the fitness and bike lounge areas. And so that all sort of framed up the conversation with Ian about, and the Copley Wolf team about, really how do we want to approach the landscape strategy. So Ian, if you don't mind just jumping in here for a minute.
Great, thanks, Brian. Hi, everybody. We wanted to start with the side-by-side comparison of what we had showed the full commission back in February compared to where we are today on the right. I won't read through all the comments that we received from the commission nor from the staff. The gist of what we heard, as you heard Brian and Tim allude to, is that we really needed to do something to make that public realm experience more dynamic and varied, and to really try to provide a hierarchy of open spaces to enrich that public realm experience. And so we heard throughout our process and in our studies that really the south side was the priority landscape move there. By shifting the massing to the north, we have the ability to make a really grand open space on the south side between our project and the McNamara House, which is a senior living facility. We now have about a 62-foot wide open space. That does a lot of really important things for us in terms of giving us the opportunity to preserve the existing trees that are on the south side of the property, mature growth there, increase the porosity between our site and McNamara House so that they can participate in that open space. And to provide activation both from the McNamara House, but also from our side of the project, as Brian had mentioned, by putting some of those shared amenity spaces on the south side of the building. So we have activation coming from the left and right on the plan, and then we have enough space to have a really grand gesture for the pedestrian connection that goes from Everett Street to the planned Wackersee development. That's basically where the Star Market is. So that was the big move. The other thing that we did is working with Jill and the staff is to really recreate the experience along Everett Street. So with the building pushing away from the curb, we've now developed two zones, one that we call the active public realm zone, which is really centered around the entry, the main door into the building, the pedestrianized garage and loading access into the garage below, and then the bike lounge front entry. So that's where all the comings and goings, the bustle of the activity happens. Further to the north or plan right is where we transition to a zone that we're calling the verdant public realm. And really what we're trying to do there is to maximize the amount of greenery, to surround that sidewalk with green on both sides, and give smaller opportunities for niche seating for the public realm. And then lastly, on the north side, which is plan right, and the west side, which is to the top of the plan, just having enough that we can accommodate the future Wackersee pedestrian zones for that future build out of that plan as it moves into the future phases.
And Tim, you're about halfway through.
Okay, really quickly wanted to just touch on tree preservation because that's been a big topic throughout this conversation. You can see that we are preserving trees on the south side of the site. There is a number of trees that we're taking out. The existing trees that are on site are primarily ailanthus, Norway maples, invasive volunteer species. So we're taking those out to make space for the new building. We're coming back with a significant planting of 83 new native trees. And you can just see from the two pie charts how we're really tilting the balance of the diversity of plants from being almost entirely non-native invasives to being a much stronger composition of native trees.
So jumping back to architecture, kind of the last bucket we really wanted to talk through with all of you. This is where we were last time. This is the initial design. Not going to spend a lot of time picking it apart. What we did is we really took a step back and started over with our strategic massing and thinking about how this building could evolve to create more diversity in the streetscape. And so there's 4 quick slides here that outline the strategy. The first is really about the position of the building on site, thinking about the connections, aggregating that public realm space, and the vehicular connection that's going to be driven from Everett Street. In the second image down on the bottom of the page, we started to think about how these two different buildings meet the ground to create really rich edges. And so you notice building 1 on the left has an elevated podium, which we needed to do to allow vehicular access to come in under the building. What that did is it gave us an opportunity that you'll see to continue to develop the architecture over there On building 2, on the right-hand side, what we did is we recessed the base to help expand the buffer and planting zone where we actually have residential units down at grade. So we're thinking about how the programming of the buildings informs the architecture, which informs the way we're treating the landscape. In the next 2 images at the top, what we started to think about is how does the building meet the sky? How do we break this massing down? And so building 1 on the left starts to develop this series of vertical notches within the building to break down the scale and work with this base that's being defined. Building 2 starts to set back the top floor, creates a fairly deep roof leg on the central leg. We have a rooftop amenity in there. And then the connector between these 2 buildings is started to push down. So we start to create this real rich variety in the massing strategies of this building. And then in the last image, the building 1 massing evolves further. We're pulling out the massing to create angled bays to support projecting balconies. Building 2, with the recesses that we're creating at the top and the bottom, we double down on that language and we push balconies in. We create this very strong horizontal language that develops a layering system for that building. If you jump to the next image, Michelle, very quickly, this is sort of an overall elevated axo, building 1 on the left, building 2 on the right. You can start to see how the architecture and how the language has developed based on these massing strategies. And if you jump to the next image, we'll start on building 1. And these are just some of the tools that we use to really drive that massing forward, thinking about a datum line, a strong brick base, creating double height, rich open spaces at the amenity under the right leg, defining the edges of the public realm, strong courtyard expression, even though it's elevated above the street to create connection, projecting balconies, warm tone, and a little bit of a playful language to the window pattern. And I think there's 2 other quick images that sort of illustrate the massing shifts and sort of the push and pull we're generating in this building. In the next image, we're going to look at building 2 over on the right-hand side. Here, we've really worked with this idea of horizontal sort of structure and the setbacks and creating a layering system where we have a warm charcoal brick base and then a wood tone that kind of wraps around the building with inset balconies, express floor lines, and you can see the roof deck here, as well as the way the sort of landscape starts to meet the edge of the building. 2 quick follow-on images to that to give you a little bit more flavor for the development of the language here. And then we have a couple of views that we wanted to share about what this looks and feels like up and down the street. So this is looking south down Everett. This is looking from the end of Raymond Street, kind of across at the building. You can see how we're really playing with the depth we're getting in these courtyards, the very different sort of massing approach, the layering systems of these buildings, creating architecture that really works together, but creates a very different language along the street. This is looking in the other direction, looking north. You can start to see the plaza space on the end of the building and the architecture as it works its way down the street, a view into the plaza and how those active edges, in this case, the bike lounge with the outdoor bikes, kind of wraps into that plaza area. And then we had a couple of quick views. Again, this building has no back. So the language and the massing strategies we're talking about here really work their way around the building. And this is sort of from the entry on Western Ave, looking across the parking lot in one direction. And then we have one other view that looks across the front of the grocer down towards the plaza on the right-hand side, sort of leaning towards what that future connection is going to be. I think just very quickly on materials, we're thinking hard about what these are and how they work together and complement each other. We have some really strongly vertically organized cement panel, fiber cement panel, a brick base down low, metal mesh projecting balconies on this side, composite accent panels. In the other building, we're really going in a little bit of a different direction where, if you can jump to the next, Michelle, where we take the tones and we play with them in a more natural way, a very dark sort of fiber cement panel at the top, the charcoal base, and then the wood composite panel. And then I think in the central connector, we're really trying to play this down. And so very simple organization of like vertical accent fins and some really, really simple, clean language there. I think
And
Ian
if you all could wrap up.
Yeah, go ahead, Ian. I know you.
Yeah, so very quickly, we just have some detailed blow-ups of these key areas. So this is the south side open space and passage. You can see the character of that with some views of how we're trying to have a very interesting paving pattern. We have an idea to enrich the public realm, which is to recall some of the past use on site, which is a former cordage factory. So we think we could dub this the rope walk and use some interesting paving detailing that would recall that, as well as some interpretive markers. Next slide. And then just some imagery of what we see for this active public realm, again, at the front entry to the building, a shot of the streetscape. And then lastly, this verdant public realm, again, really playing up the vegetation around the residential units on the north side. And then a view looking back from the sidewalk. And I think with that, we are concluded.
And as I turn it over to the commissioners, could you please go back to one of the early site slides that with the aerial that shows the site in context? For those who may not remember, during the original introduction many months ago, right? This is a site in the Wackersey planning study area, and it's part of a much larger, almost super block today that's mostly constituted by a stop and shop and a large parking area. Part of the Wackersey planning was about introducing a finer grain scale of streets into this super block. I would suggest going back further.
Go to the site plan, Michelle, if you could.
And so the strategy here was essentially that on the north, which is right on page, and the western, which is up on page, edges of the site, the proponent is creating the conditions for future roadways. They are building the sidewalks and curbs and street trees that will go there. And when the adjacent properties are redeveloped, we intend to work with those proponents to realize the street network that would wind up going both up on page to the right of the northern property line and then left right on page behind this, creating that next level of block structure.
And Seth, it would be really helpful, at least for me, I know this is a neighborhood that's really changing as we speak today. So like car repair garages are turning into theaters, and and so maybe the next time around when this proponent comes forward, we could have just like I don't need a expanded presentation, but just like an overall plan of the approved projects within proximity, and then the kind of proposed roadways and things that you discussed, so that we kind of see this not as it is today, but what it aspires to tomorrow. I think that'd be very helpful. A question I have, just to cite myself, I do know this area a little bit. The building to the right in this plan, is that the Petco?
Yes.
Okay. So this is and is that being redeveloped? Or is that staying?
Not at this time, but
Not
we
at this
expect
time.
it to at some
Okay.
point.
Don't mean to start any controversy. I'm just asking the question because I just remember that wall. It's a wall against that pedestrian experience, right? Okay. And then the last question I have is, are these inset courtyards at a grade level higher, or do you just have a fence in the front and you're dividing the pedestrian from those courtyards?
Yep, they're at sidewalk level, but there will be some type of a fence that's integrated into landscape to designate the resident area from the public realm.
I want to pursue where Mick Young was going. Actually, thank you for this drawing. That's where I was going to ask you to go. No, good. The one back, yeah.
Okay.
So, I wish we could back out of this a little more. Do you have anything that shows the Stop and Shop and the huge surface parking lot?
We do. Michelle, maybe if you get out of presentation mode and just go to the.
Just keep doing, Doc.
There you go.
So is there anywhere, has anyone, as part of Wackersey or something else, looked at a more comprehensive redevelopment of this whole site? I know that streets don't align, but what's someday Stop and Shop, I'm making a huge leap of faith, and you could tell me I'm completely wrong, but someday Stop and Shop goes away. And that giant surface parking lot is becomes way too valuable, and maybe Stop and Shop doesn't go away, but its parking becomes somehow structured, and you recover 2/3 of that parking lot as development. And has anybody thought about, well, if that story all became true, would those streets would you pull those through that, or take the street to the west and pull that street through? I know they won't align, they won't exactly connect, but I saw in your massing model that you had thought about what would happen to the Petco site, what might happen to the surface parking lot. I'm just wondering if you take a view of, and I assume that your client only controls what's in the red, but what's the bigger idea here? What's the future texture? And are we doing anything with this site that might prevent a more cohesive plan somewhere in the future?
I brought up a slide from our original introduction of this project. I don't know if folks can see this.
Not yet, Seth.
We can see it. It's a different tab at the top of the screen share.
Okay, I can see it. Oh,
Let me try that
I
one more
can't
time.
see it now, John.
Dare I tempt fate?
Gee, I'm happy to log off if that helps everyone, so.
Okay, how about now?
Yes. So
No,
Michelle, maybe if you stop sharing, then Seth's will
Okay.
be the only thing shared.
I can see it. Yeah.
There we go.
Ah, there we go.
Okay.
Now I see.
So this was a slide that we presented at the introduction of this project.
Ah, okay.
But back when the project was shifted further left on site, and we were proposing to shift it right at that time. The proposal was to integrate the street network and have that shared equally between this proponent's site and the adjacent site on both the north, which is right on page, and the west, which is up on page. And if you see this sort of inset diagram here, this was the sort of diagrammatic representation of what was included in the Wackersey planning, which was meant to extend the street network past Everett Street into this area, and then make at least one, if not multiple connections up to the Telford Street, I believe up there, and then this one further to the left. The Wackersey study did not take into account parcelization. For instance, the alignment of this street would go right through the senior housing facility here at the edge, and carrying this street through would not allow for the, we think, the highest and best use of this site. So in working through with our transportation team, with BTD, and this proponent decided that we still needed that east-west connection that would happen on the right-up page that could continue in the future, and that a north-south connection would be created here, and then one or multiple connections could continue to be made to Telford Street here with the redevelopment of these larger parcels. And what you saw in the proponent's presentation was some speculative thinking of what those proposals might eventually be, but we have no master plan for that. This is the one property owner, so we believe that we will have the opportunity to help shape that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, what David was mentioned, he used the word, I think David, you used the word grain. Could we go back to your site plan? And I am a little confused by the project because I'm not sure what the attitude is towards the grain. And so I know that like sort of south of this, if you look at a kind of Noli map, let's say, it's lots of small single family or multifamily homes. And then you go plan northwest and it's these huge big box structures, which, as I understand it now, remain today, and then in the next 5 to 10 years will remain. and they have a back and a front. They tend to front towards the inside of this space and away from Everett. And I'm not sure what the building strategy is here, because just massing wise, it still feels like a big box structure, even though you've done some nice gestures of pulling the landscape in and out. It still feels like it's part of the Stop and Shop and the Petco language. And maybe I'm developing a kind of bias towards this is all residential, and I know you have, you need to maximize the number of units and all of these things, but is there a way to further create a kind of a pedestrian residential streetscape? I do appreciate that you don't say this is the front or this is the back, but in reality, Everett Street is kind of the front because you have all these individual houses, and I just wonder if there's a way of taking a stance.
Yeah.
And one thing is, like, I'm going to say something that might be controversial and may not even be viable, but just having, like, if I squint, you still have like this block. And is there any way that what's green could somehow slice through the white north-south through this plan in some way, so that it starts to break down that scale a little bit and signal the future of this? Because I've seen a lot of projects in this neighborhood, and some of them are housing, and they're all these massive blocks, and we've approved them and they've gone through. This feels like it's like a bridge. It could be a bridge between the neighborhood that exists today and the future of what that could be, what Star Market becomes. And I worry that this whole neighborhood's going to turn into these kind of giant housing complexes without a sense of a neighborhood character. And so it's just my first reaction is that, like, it's a simple question. Does it have to be such a big mass? I'm not convinced, although I like it, that you have to have such a big park next to McNamara House and this. If that helps you break down the scale of this so that you create, instead of an apartment complex, you create more of a sense of a campus or a village. I'm trying to think of words that bring a more humanistic scale to this, because I think there's some details in the landscape and the facades that are nice. But I have an issue with the larger strategic massing of things. And so that's my first thought on the project.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the comment, and I won't try to be defensive here. I think it's a great comment. I think we did really have, and we didn't spend a lot of time here, but there was a really sort of deliberate strategy to the approach here. And the idea was, if you can go back, Michelle, to the first picture slide, or the second one where we have the sections, we did do we spent a lot of time thinking about the neighborhood and sort of how this plugs in multiple different directions.
Oh, that's so helpful. Yeah. So you can see, like, to the left is all these, like, 2 to 3 story homes.
Right.
And you're the bridge between the two. You can
we
make
are
a decision, right?
Yeah, we are the bridge. So what we tried to do is take a really strong stand here in terms of the way we were thinking about this, and try to act as much like a bridge as we could. And so rather than turn the long edge of the building, which would naturally be more efficient against the street edge, we took a really deliberate attempt to go end on to the street and create a rhythm and a texture of building and courtyard that would develop sort of a conversation with the neighborhood a little bit more rather than an edge. And I completely understand your comment. We did spend a lot of time thinking about scale in both directions, kind of working to bridge the neighborhood. And I think what we ended up with is sort of a very clear strategy in our minds of putting the larger edges of the building to the north the smaller edges to the south, letting the green space seep in and create this rhythm and this texture. I do think we did explore quite a bit of how do we make a pedestrian connection. We looked at splitting it in 2 separate buildings. We looked at sort of, you know, creating an opening for 2 floors at the ground level. We spent a tremendous amount of time on those strategies. And one of the problems we kept running into was just sort of the ability to create an operationally cohesive building for Mill Creek here that wouldn't require, you know, sort of all that. So we did, I know we didn't spend a lot of time on it here, but we did spend a long time really analyzing the neighborhood, really thinking about the strategy and how we wanted to kind of create that bridge. You know, the success of that is certainly up for conversation for sure, right? So I appreciate your comment.
Can we see the site plan again? Because right now, or the designed plan, because right now, all of if I cut a section through all the courtyards to the various streetscapes, they're all very similar, right? Like all the ones on Everett Street, they vary in size slightly, but they're all kind of fronting. And then you have the problem of like putting a fence in front of it. And then same thing on the back side, or I won't call it the back side, but like on the Star Market side.
Yep.
And I just wonder if like the two, have you looked at a scheme? And I don't even know if this would be nicer, but a scheme where the two center ones do something different. Like they create a courtyard in the middle and the building sort of frames it instead of everything being like sort of crenulated along the street edge.
Yep.
And I guess what I really appreciate about the gesture here is it's very hopeful for the future of this neighborhood. But I wonder if it won't be a while before this neighborhood really transforms into a kind of a pedestrian, beautiful streetscape, and whether for the residents you want to create some diversity of architecture to landscape somehow that's not always facing either the large parking lot at Star Market or this kind of streetscape along Everett Street.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know how to respond thoughtfully to the proposal without knowing what to anticipate.
Yeah.
What happens next, so that you come back in 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is, and this is a building that fits into a texture that connects Everett, and I'm not sure I know the name of this. Is that Telford to the top of the page, Telford, and the big surface parking lot is gone, and maybe Star's still there. That's probably beloved, but parking's been taken care of in another way, and there's pedestrian paths that run east, west, and north, south, and that all maybe what and I agree with what Mick Young said. I like what you've done, Ian, but I just wonder if it's in the right place, and I don't know if it's in the right place because I don't know what the next, even how to anticipate the next pieces.
Mm-hmm.
If I look at it, an exhibit that I would love to see is this building, your proposed building, sitting in the bigger context instead of just the red box, and maybe that would help a little bit more. But one specific thing I would say is, if this is the building, yeah, there you go. That you desperately want to start drawing lines that run east and west and north and south in anticipation of what is going to happen over time. But and if I look at this just as it is, as you've presented it, you've created two buildings and then connected the two buildings to make one building, and left an almost unsolvable problem, design problem of what's the piece in between. You know, I can say, look at the building on the west. Okay, I get it. That's I like, you know, architecturally, I understand what you're doing, and look at the building on the east, and architecturally, I understand what you're doing. What's the piece in the middle? And you know, you sort of want it to be negative space, but of course it's not. It's a building, and now it's a third building, or it's a third architecture. And I don't have any idea of what to make it. I could make it if you told me it was green space. Okay, and kind of ironically, or I don't know, coincidentally or accidentally, it lines up with the green islands in the parking. I don't know if that means anything, but you know, I mean, I could imagine it as green space, because then I have two buildings, each has their own identity. You're starting to get to the scale, at least starting to get to the scale that Nick Young is referring to. But I don't think you or your client want to do that, because now you've got two cores and you've got 4 stairs and all of those things that when you divide it in half. So I guess I feel like a lot of assumptions have been made, and they're not bad assumptions in the context of a single parcel, but I don't know how to evaluate them in the context of everything that I see happening around me, around the site, I mean, and what I could imagine it is in the future. Even if I simply said, well, you know what, I think that the street that's going to pull through is Raymond, and Raymond's going to connect Everett and Telford just in a straight line. I'm not going to try to bend it or even line up streets. And so I'm going to take that green space that you've got on the west and put it on the east in anticipation that Petco is going to become a building and Raymond's going to become a street. And there's going to be street buildings lining Western Ave. I'm creating a total fiction here, and I don't know that all of the rest of this site is in a single ownership or not. But I guess I don't know how to create a context for what now feels like everything around this is going to change over the next 20 years, and should, by the way. I mean, replace this surface parking lot, make a continuous street wall on Western Ave, build more housing at whatever, 5 stories or whatever the right height is or density is. But are we just precluding some bigger moves of connectivity?
I do want to jump in. My name is Jonathan Palazzolo. I'm the UD primary, and I've been working with Seth and the team on this project. And I do want to speak to some of the context that Commissioner Manfredi and Commissioner Kim have been responding to. We did ask the team, and it's a real priority of the planning department that they accommodate that future mobility throughout the neighborhood and connecting the streets in various ways. So we did ask them to provide for the sidewalk, at least the sidewalk portion of a future street just to their north, so plan right, and then the sidewalk portion of a future street that would happen on plan north, so their west side. So that's a little bit of the context. And we know that there will be some future street connections that go beyond that. We don't know exactly the shape they will take. As Seth had mentioned, that is one big property owner to their west and north. So we're going to work with them when we get to that point. But we do envision a future pedestrian zone that we asked this team to accommodate on the west and the north side. We also felt we did ask them to explore some of the greenery and pedestrian connections that cut through the middle of the building. And we felt this mobility on the north and the west side of the building was slightly more convincing as a truly public zone. We didn't know that pedestrians would feel comfortable cutting through the middle of the property. So, which is another reason why we asked them to focus on making a truly public south and accommodate those north and west public pedestrian zones on the sidewalk. Just a little context for everyone.
Just a thought, like every time we see the building drawn, it doesn't help the clarification that I think we're asking for when the entire kind of footprint is one color.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's either white or it's red. And I wonder if strategically, maybe it's not possible to break down the building, although I saw in some of your sketches, you had looked at like maybe ground floor kind of movement. I mean, it's a tough problem because you make north-south connections, even in the park you do that, but what are we connecting to? You know, what is it? But I wonder if the first step in this process is like either the footprint of the building or the facade or something like that, that there's some kind of more minor tweaking that can happen north-south that can help you break down this block, at least conceptually. Because I just wonder if it's constantly drawn as like this, reminds me of a Lego or something.
Right.
Like as one big Lego, but to break it down so that we can understand it and your team can understand, like, is this a bunch of more discrete scaled units, not just planimetrically, but also elevationally, which would allow for you maybe to put some gardens at upper levels or something like that, that would start to break this down perceptually, even if you don't literally cut a hole in the middle of it or cut through it. But for me, I feel like it's not quite a block. It's not a mega block building, and it's definitely not a village with like individual feelings of openings, but it feels like it's a little confused. It's trying to do a little bit of both. And I would recommend kind of maybe studying this first and maybe making like massing models with like 2 different colors of foam that kind of break down the building as well, so that I'm sure you've studied this in certain ways, but the way you've presented it to us, it feels like you took a solid piece of like foam and then cut out like these little crevices and then laid it down on the site. And it feels like you guys are going to be the first kids on the block. So we want you to be a good role model and really like encourage the rest of the people who come in and redo, not to put another huge block building in.
Yeah.
So we understand there are financial constraints, there's development constraints, but I think there is conceptual thinking in the development of this that you could kind of come back to us with ways in which this could feel like more individualized units without necessarily breaking up the entire block. Sorry, that's the best I can come up with.
That's a great, Michelle, can you just go to 18 just for a second? I think that comment is fantastic. I think we're not helping ourselves with the way we're representing this thing planimetrically for sure. I think one of the things we've been doing is most of the design work we've been doing with landscape and with the building and thinking about it has been in these sort of 3D models where we are starting to push that, connector down a little bit. And I agree. I think there's more work to be done there, but we're really like thinking about this as 2 buildings. And Mr. Manfredi had a fantastic comment, obviously, like, what do you do with the middle here? We've been really playing around with that quite a bit. And I think there's more work to be done there with the massing to change the scale of how that is working in a way that will feel more divorced from either of these 2 buildings. And so I think we are thinking about it in the 3rd dimension. We're not showing it that way. And I think your comment is great. It does change the way you look at the planning for sure.
Could I jump in with one other piece too? I appreciate all the comments, and Jonathan, your context is really helpful. I thought I've shared my screen. I don't know, Michelle, if you can unshare, because what I wanted to show, which is responsive to one of Mr. Manfredi's questions, right? Which is what could be the future context, and obviously none of us know today, but what we and I believe, and I want to speak for staff, but I think part of what they're looking at as well is the Wackersy study and the conceptual plan that's shown there. Can you see that? I have a So this is the Wackersy study as adopted, and this is obviously one of many diagrams. But I think a couple things that started to help inform our site studies, and again, Seth and Jonathan, please jump in. But one thing was, so this is our site right here. If you can see my cursor. And so one thing that was conceived as part of the Wacker-Z study was that the footprint of the actual Star Market in the future is proposed as green space. So that starts to really make sense for that open space on the southern edge of our property, that where it abuts McNamara House, to be that connection space from the neighborhood to the east over through to a new larger open space. So I think it was that, combined with the fact that, to your point, we know that the Petco and the parking lot and things are going to be redeveloped at some point in the future, but we also know and hope that the McNamara House is there for a very long time. And so that made sense to us to say, all right, if we're going to have open space, let's treat it in an area where it can be shared with the McNamara House, a longstanding, obviously, community asset. And so that was one piece. And obviously there are other aspects here of what's shown on the screen, but one piece that helped inform the placement of the open space on the southern edge of the site.
This is very helpful. I'm reading this as if, let me see where, on the north of your parcel, it's open, and then it's open to the, let me see, west, as it to give the, I think that's open. I think that's a light gray, and so there's a pedestrian way that cuts through, cuts there and the other way too. Doesn't it keep going?
That's right.
Yeah.
And I believe, and that's really what a portion, our site would take on a portion of that future network. And then the property owner that surrounds us, is thought to, potentially take on the remainder of that. And there already is that vehicular access point directly to our north off of Everett Street and into what, today is that parking area.
This diagram, I'm gonna offend both Brian and Mick Young with this, but I don't mean to. That I think you actually want to. Well, I think an alternative is that you make it one building, because what this plan is showing is, look, Western Avenue is changing dramatically, as somebody said. We know that bigger buildings, change of scale, and the neighborhood of single family and triple deckers and behind it is there's an edge. There's an edge on the south side of Western, and it's we know what's going. I think it's all under construction, isn't it, on the parcel directly?
Yes,
yeah, and the high-rise residential buildings. I think I just drove past there, and that steel is up on the what is that, north side of Western. Yeah. No, I'm at. Is it no? Oh. Go further. Go west. I'm talking about the buildings that no, I'm more in the middle, directly across the street. Yeah, right in there. Aren't those under construction? That's all the Davis Company. Yeah. Those towers I've seen steel, I don't know, 12 stories, 14 stories. And so that's what this is going to be, and that kind of that peninsula that runs all the way to the Pike, and the project we've seen and approved to the south. There's a scale to all of that. But then it tells me that, why are we making 2 buildings or 3 buildings? Why aren't we making 1 building? Have to be consistent across the entire length of it. It could be, it could have some diversity, but rather than making it 2 completely distinct pieces, if you had a sense that you were going to get that east-west connection, pedestrian, that north-south connection, love the park space. I don't know if that's that's even possible, but and it looks like it's in the right place, the park that sits on the Star site, because the park becomes the bridge between the south neighborhood and the north neighborhood. It makes me think more of one building than two buildings or three buildings. In just in terms of architecture.
Yeah, we did. That's a great comment, David. We did start there, and when we started drawing the sections, those long running sections through the site, we sort of thought about, you know, the scale on either edge kind of moderating towards the middle where that connection is, and thinking about, rather than, you know, building the entire thing as a monolithic peninsula, what if, you know, we took the strategy of, if you go to the sections again, Michelle, of taking the height on either side and bringing it down in the middle to sort of start to create a little relief in the neighborhood. And then on the south side of our building, you know, where that cut through would be to connect to the park, it sort of starts to bring the scale down, indicative of the pedestrian connection we were trying to drive to. So I completely understand your comment. We did sort of a lot of really similar analysis, and we thought maybe the best thing that we could do is manage the scale in the middle and sew the fabric of the neighborhood together where we could a little bit more. So it's a really interesting comment, one we thought quite a bit about. We did start with one building.
You know, that is true, David, because there are two other apartment complexes that have been built in this neighborhood along Western Ave, though.
Yeah.
And their edge is really strong. They don't
Yeah.
try to, they make it a very urban edge. And they don't try to differentiate it, and they don't put, because even with the design as it is, I was trying to, like, when I get confused, I try to put a name to it, and these green spaces that kind of eat into the, are they porches? Are they, because they don't quite feel like courtyards to me. And
Yeah.
so that might be a strategy, is you could go the entire other way and say, it's a single building, it's urban, it's new, it's not like the neighborhood. But I think I'd just love a clearer point of view.
Well, and as you do those studies, I think the landscape could have a big influence here. I'm a little concerned about at least the perceived size of those courtyards on Everett Street. I'm not sure, and then adding fences, you know, which I think I saw in one of the perspectives, looked like they were solid, but I may be wrong about that. It doesn't matter. But I'm wondering whether or not having the landscape in kind of these smaller courtyards is the right thing to do, especially if you start looking at this as one building again. Like we're just going to have to call it the back, the courtyard on the back of the building, you know, will that ever be used? Is that, you know, is that worth it? Is it worth to, you know, take that green space, or I'll say part of the building, and give it to landscape? And would it be better to have something that is much more generous on Everett Street? I don't know, but I think in the exploration of what David and Nick Young have been talking about, I think the landscape is up for grabs as well in terms of how it's arranged. You know, you made I think pushing the building right, you know, makes a big difference. But it has, I'll just say that it does make a big difference, though. I want to be careful about making that park feel like a pass through when it's not really.
Yeah.
Because it can always be changed in the future, but it should end, right? It should not feel like it's looking at the back loading area of Star Market, but instead, you know, more contained, as I think you mean it to. And then next time around, we don't have to spend time doing this, but I would love to see the building entrances defined so we can understand how people come and go.
Mhm.
And then, let's see. Oh, and maybe next time, and I'm only gonna say this because we don't know what we're gonna see next time. Explain why you moved the service parking entry to the to Everett versus next to Petco as you had in the past. And I'm sure there's something internal or maybe turning radii or something, but maybe next time take a little time to explain that as well. But I think that, you know, you've been very you've been really trying to look out for this parcel. I do think that genuinely. And it's not quite there. And I think that Mick Young and David's comments kind of summarize some of the things that could be looked at.
Yeah, Laura, I think the danger, this is to Ian and Brian, which is that everybody's looking at your plan and seeing what they want to see. And I think that's very dangerous. You guys are the design team, you're the proponents. So you've heard wholly different strategies for the project.
Yep.
And although it's very kind of you to leave the door open for us, I would recommend against it because it'll just get with BCDC a very muddled conversation. And so you've gotten two or three very different points of view about things. And I think it would be great to have a singular kind of point of view, any of which I think could work. And so that you could guide us and say, this is what's important to us. This is how we're going through it. And so that we could kind of work with you instead of all of our thought bubbles have different things over our heads right now.
Yeah.
And you've allowed that. And so in my mind as a designer, that's very bad. You don't want that. You want to tell us what the thought bubble should be above, and then we can react against it. We can help refine it, but, or we can say we don't see it. So it's a tough site. And I would say you should.
I think that's a
based-
really fair statement. Mickey.
Yeah, and
You're
Laura,
right.
what you just said about the connection, I think you also have to think about what you're designing for today.
Right.
Because given
Yep.
the situation we're in economically and stuff, things may not change for the next 7 to 10 years. And you have to make a great space for these folks. And so I would think about the future, but also really think about tomorrow, like literally tomorrow. Sorry, Laura, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I think you're right. We don't necessarily want all the Legos thrown in the air and because there's a lot that's good here.
Yeah.
There
No,
really is.
listen, I really appreciate the comments. I think we do have a very clear idea of what we're trying to do here. And I
Yeah,
think
good.
we have a very clear strategy. I think I understand. I mean, we want to be very good listeners. And I think we let those comments inform how we approach the next generation of our strategy. I don't think we believe in anything fundamentally differently about the site. I do think we need to listen. You guys had a lot of really interesting comments. I like to listen, gestate, and then come back to you guys. We're not going to throw everything away. I think we have a pretty strong belief in how we're looking at the global context and thinking about the building as a bridge. I think your comments about the scale and position of the courtyards and how they react to the street and inform the building back and forth, they're great comments. So I completely understand your position. I don't want you to think that we don't have a really strong idea of what we're trying to do. We're just trying to be good listeners right now.
It would also help on a plan like this where the building looks so massive because it's white.
Yeah.
But to break it down for us to understand the different levels, I think that would help a lot.
Yeah, that's a good comment.
Yeah. So the next group hopefully one of us will be in the next subcommittee meeting, but we can't guarantee it because we don't control that. But I think you want to start with, I don't know who, Seth, who brought up the kind of strategic, maybe it was Tim who brought up the strategic master plan. You want to start with that and maybe even go a little wider and maybe update. I think some of the buildings should probably get updated, I think, if I recall correctly. And so that people don't start off getting confused about what the future looks like and what your stance is with that future development. I guess I would recommend that this.
McYoung, maybe before we make a
Yeah.
recommendation, we can get public comment.
Oh, sorry about that.
So Michelle, if I could ask you to stop sharing, and I will try to share. Temp fade again. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen at this time. We'd like to invite any members of the public in attendance who may wish to contribute public testimony to raise your digital hand, and I will call on you. If you are calling in by phone, press the number 9 on your dial pad to activate the raise hand function and dial 6 to unmute yourself. Please state your name and any relevant project affiliation information. Please keep comments to 2 minutes. And so I would like to see if there are any public comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands for public comments. So commissioners, I do see a hand. Barbara, if you can unmute yourself now, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Eisman. Has there been any shadow studies on this? As I notice, this building is far taller than anything on the other side of the street, which doesn't top off 3 stories. In fact, the little apartment buildings on the other side of the street, and that's Everett Street. In fact, the 3rd floor is dormers in a roof. I know McNamara House is 6 stories. It's also set very far back on its lot. So you don't get the impression it's going to fall and crush you. Have you had any shadow studies as to how this is going to affect the very resilient homeowners of Lower Alston?
I could take that one. I do know there were shadow studies included in the PNF submission. That may be a slightly different building configuration at this point, but we can continue to look at that.
Okay, I just have a question. In regards to the line of trees that are closest to Everett Street, are those City of Boston trees?
Yes, there's 5 public street trees that are along the curb line on Everett Street, and those are all going to remain.
Okay, so you could face the probable scenario where City of Boston doesn't plant any more trees there. So in fact, you'd have a sidewalk directly on the road, correct?
Well, we're proposing to add more trees to the existing that we're preserving in that strip, just up and down the road length there.
And that would be from the developer or from the City of Boston?
The developer.
Okay, that would be good. Then that would be like a mitigation to the community, correct?
Yeah, it would be part of the project design.
Okay, I'm very concerned about my neighbors in Lower Alston. When I look at a development like this, and then I look on North Harvard Street, and I see a really inappropriate building where the Hill Church is, and I realize Harvard University, et cetera, has an economic interest in it. I see 2 hands crushing Lower Alston. And I wonder, since one of our mayor's initiatives is to have more homeowners, et cetera, to stabilize neighborhoods, I wonder how this area is going to be protected. That's come up a couple times tonight. We've talked about the larger plan. And I'm wondering what the larger plan is. Is it to eliminate Lower Alston, or is it to preserve Lower Alston?
Thank you, Barbara. I'm sorry. Can you tell me how to pronounce your last name?
Jane.
Jean. Thank you, Barbara. I can respond to part of your comment regarding overall policy and strategy goals. I think, as you know, it's a priority of this administration to increase housing in the city of various different types. And in this case, there's not the Wackersy plan, even done under the previous administration, also supported that goal of increasing housing, specifically in the Wackersy area. It does not speak to housing type, whether it's for sale or rental. And there are additional policies that will be coming out of the mayor's office that can help speak to that and in support of both home ownership and overall housing production, including rental.
Well, most of the new units that have opened up in Brighton, at least, and in Alston, Brighton, a 2-bedroom rents for about $4,600 a month, which is about $55,000 a year, which is more than what the median income is for people in Alston, Brighton. So opening up these types of units is not going to relieve housing in Alston, Brighton. It is going to totally switch over the population, and where people who are maybe making $38,000 a year are going to go, we don't know. And the solution of well, you have to have a voucher, you have to have a subsidy, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's a viable solution either, because you're just putting the burden of excessively high rents on working people. So I know a lot of proposed developments I've listened to in the last several weeks. People, it's like, well, we have 17% affordability, but affordability is a myth, because the minimum incomes that the developer wants are more than the median incomes of the average person living in Alston, Brighton. So again, it's basically, if you're not making some fantastical salary, you need to get out. And I don't see, I guess that is one way of solving your housing crisis, is to drive everybody out who can't pay, but they're going to go somewhere, and they're probably going to stay in Massachusetts somewhere. In regards to affordability,
Ms. Jean, thank you for your comments. We
you're
sort of
welcome.
far exceeded the 2-minute, but we
I'm
very
sorry,
much appreciate it.
I didn't realize it's 2 minutes. Thank you so much, Mr. Reisman.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Do we have any additional public comment? Okay, seeing none, I will close the public comment period and turn it back to the commissioners to discuss next steps.
I guess I would say this. I think Nick Young offered some wise counsel, and clearly we have to come back to subcommittee. But I think I would, at this point, after a lot of discussion, leave that to Brian and Ian and the proponent and the design team to take a position on what is in the best interest of the public realm, what's in the best interest of your client, and what's in the best interest of your neighborhood.
Commissioners, thank you for your comments tonight. Thank the public. I thank the proponent. I think there's clearly a lot of competing interests and approaches that it was clear that you all are looking for clarification on, and staff is certainly committed to working with the proponent to advance that in the coming weeks. And based on what I'm hearing tonight, this is recommended for additional review at Design Review Subcommittee. So we'll proceed in that manner unless there are any final comments to close out the conversation tonight.
Seth, if you could make sure that one of the three of us could be in attendance, just to provide consistency to this design team. I also just want to say thank you to the design team. It's clear you guys have done a lot of work. There's lot of detail in the design. And so we do appreciate that. So
Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
comments from everyone. Appreciate it.
Well,
Okay.
Thank you.
And with that, I believe we are done for the evening. No official vote to close out. So I hope everybody has a great evening. And as always, thank you everyone for your time and counsel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Good night.